Two people start their careers with identical $50,000 salaries and similar financial situations. 20 years later, one is still living paycheck to paycheck, stressed about monthly bills and uncertain about retirement. The other has built substantial wealth and achieved financial independence. What created this dramatic difference? It wasn't luck, inheritance, or secret investment strategies. The difference lies in understanding three predictable stages of wealth building that most Americans either ignore or abandon too early. These stages explain why wealth building feels impossibly slow for years before suddenly accelerating, and why most people quit right before their money starts working harder than they do. Warren Buffett made 99% of his wealth after age 50. Not because he got smarter, but because he had finally built enough capital for these stages to demonstrate their power. Understanding where you are in this progression and what to expect next can transform years of financial frustration into strategic progress. What I'm about to reveal shows why your net worth will explode at three specific points and why most people never reach even the first one. Stage 1. The compound interest threshold. The first stage of wealth building represents the most psychologically challenging period because the mathematical results feel completely disconnected from the effort required. This disconnect causes most Americans to abandon their wealth building efforts just before compound interest begins, demonstrating its true power, creating a tragic pattern where people restart their financial journey repeatedly instead of pushing through to meaningful results. Let me show you exactly why this happens. When you invest $1,000 and earn a 10% return, you gain $100. Enough for a nice dinner, but hardly life-changing money. The same percentage applied to $5,000 yields $500, which might cover a car repair, but doesn't feel like progress toward financial independence. Even reaching $10,000 and earning $1,000 annually often feels inadequate when compared to the years of sacrifice required to accumulate that initial capital. This mathematical reality explains why Warren Buffett accumulated 99% of his wealth after age 50 despite starting his investing career as a teenager. His early decades weren't spent making poor investment decisions. They were spent building the capital base that would eventually enable compound returns to generate billions annually. The same investment skills that produce modest absolute returns on small amounts later produced enormous absolute returns on large amounts. However, the threshold where compound interest becomes psychologically meaningful varies significantly among individuals based on their income, expenses, and financial goals. For someone earning $40,000 annually, reaching $25,000 in investments might represent the turning point where annual returns begin affecting their daily financial stress. For someone earning $100,000, the meaningful threshold might be $75,000 or $100,000 in invested assets. The key insight involves understanding that this stage requires a fundamental shift in mindset from seeking immediate gratification to accepting delayed but exponentially larger rewards. This psychological challenge proves particularly difficult in a culture that emphasizes instant results and constant stimulation. Watching your investment account grow slowly while friends purchase expensive cars or take elaborate vacations requires genuine conviction about long-term financial principles. The timeline for reaching critical mass typically spans 5 to 15 years for most middle-class earners, depending on savings rates, investment returns, and starting points. Someone saving $500 monthly with 7% annual returns would accumulate approximately $50,000 after 7 years, while the same monthly savings extended to 15 years would reach roughly $150,000. These projections assume consistent market performance that may not occur in reality, making actual timelines potentially longer or shorter based on economic conditions. During this accumulation phase, your primary focus should center on two controllable factors: your savings rate and investment consistency. Market returns fluctuate beyond your control, but maintaining high savings rates and regular investment contributions remains within your direct influence. Research suggests that savings rate affects wealth accumulation more significantly than investment selection during early wealth building years. Investment consistency proves equally important because it enables dollar-cost averaging that can improve long-term returns while reducing the impact of market timing. Regular monthly investments automatically purchase more shares when prices are low and fewer shares when prices are high, potentially improving your average cost basis over time. However, this stage involves real psychological challenges that extend beyond just mathematical patience. Social pressure to maintain lifestyle standards comparable to peers can undermine savings discipline, particularly when friends and family don't share your long-term financial priorities. The sacrifice required to maintain high savings rates while others enjoy immediate consumption can create feelings of deprivation or social isolation. Market volatility adds another psychological burden during this stage because temporary losses feel particularly painful when your account balance remains relatively small. A 20% market decline on $10,000 represents $2,000 in losses money that might have taken months to save. Understanding that market volatility is normal and temporary becomes crucial for maintaining investment discipline during inevitable downturns. Building wealth during this stage often feels like pushing a boulder uphill, enormous effort for minimal visible progress. However, the foundation you build during these years determines whether you'll ever reach the subsequent stages where wealth building accelerates dramatically. Every dollar invested during this period has the longest time to compound, making early contributions disproportionately valuable compared to larger contributions made later. The practical approach for navigating this stage involves setting intermediate milestones that provide psychological reinforcement before reaching the ultimate threshold. Celebrating reaching $5,000, then $10,000, then $25,000 in investments helps maintain motivation during the years when annual returns remain modest. Most importantly, understand that this stage represents a test of your commitment to long-term thinking, rather than a reflection of your investment skills or financial intelligence. The people who successfully navigate this period and reach subsequent wealth-building stages aren't necessarily smarter or more skilled. They simply maintain discipline long enough for mathematics to work in their favor. Stage 2. The passive income crossover. The second stage of wealth building represents a fundamental shift from accumulating assets to generating sufficient investment income to cover basic living expenses. This crossover point creates psychological and practical changes that extend far beyond the mathematical achievement. But reaching this stage requires substantial capital accumulation and realistic expectations about both the timeline and challenges involved. Understanding what constitutes the passive income crossover requires a precise definition of both passive income and basic expenses. Passive income includes dividends from stocks, interest from bonds, rental income from real estate, royalties from intellectual property, and distributions from businesses you own but don't actively manage. However, truly passive income often requires significant upfront work or capital investment, and many income streams labeled passive actually require ongoing management and attention. Basic expenses typically include housing costs, food, utilities, transportation, insurance, and other necessities for maintaining your current lifestyle. The crossover occurs when your passive income reliably covers these essential costs without requiring employment income for survival. This doesn't necessarily mean covering all discretionary spending or maintaining an expensive lifestyle. It means achieving basic financial independence that provides options and reduces stress. The capital requirements for reaching this stage vary dramatically based on your expense level and chosen investment strategies. Using the traditional 4% withdrawal rule as a rough guideline, someone with $40,000 in annual basic expenses would need approximately $1 million in invested assets to generate sufficient income. However, this calculation assumes average market returns and doesn't account for factors like inflation, market volatility, or changing personal circumstances. Dividend-focused investment strategies might require different capital amounts depending on yield rates and dividend growth prospects. If you can build a portfolio yielding 4 to 5% annually in dividends, you might need $800,000 to $1 million to generate $40,000 in annual income. However, dividend payments aren't guaranteed and can be reduced during economic downturns, making this approach potentially less reliable than diversified total return strategies. Real estate investment represents another path toward passive income generation, though the passive nature often proves overstated. Rental properties can generate cash flow that covers expenses, but property management, maintenance, vacancy periods, and tenant issues require ongoing attention and periodic capital investment. The timeline for reaching this stage typically spans 15 to 30 years for most middle-class earners, depending on savings rates, investment returns, expense levels, and starting points. Someone saving $2,000 monthly with 7% average returns would accumulate approximately $1 million after 23 years, assuming consistent market performance that may not occur in reality. Higher savings rates can accelerate this timeline, while lower savings rates or poor market performance can extend it significantly. However, the psychological transformation that occurs during this stage often proves more valuable than the mathematical achievement. When your basic expenses are covered by investment income, employment becomes a choice rather than a necessity. This psychological shift affects career decisions, risk tolerance, and overall life satisfaction in ways that pure financial calculations cannot capture. The freedom to leave unsatisfactory employment, pursue meaningful work regardless of compensation, or take extended breaks for family, education, or personal interest provides value that extends beyond monetary considerations. Many people report that reaching this stage reduces daily stress and anxiety even when they continue working, simply because they have options that weren't previously available. Building toward this stage requires strategic planning that balances growth and income generation. During early accumulation years, focusing primarily on growth investments often provides better long-term results than emphasizing current income. However, as you approach the crossover point, gradually shifting toward more income-generating assets can provide the cash flow needed for financial independence. Geographic arbitrage can significantly affect the capital requirements for this stage. Basic living expenses of $30,000 annually in low-cost areas require substantially less capital than $60,000 expenses in expensive metropolitan regions. However, relocating specifically to reduce expenses involves trade-offs, including career opportunities, family proximity, and lifestyle preferences that may not justify the financial benefits. Tax planning becomes increasingly important during this stage because investment income often receives different tax treatment than employment income. Understanding the implications of dividend taxes, capital gains rates, and asset location strategies can significantly affect your after-tax income and required asset levels. Healthcare considerations present particular challenges for people pursuing financial independence before traditional retirement age. Without employer-provided health insurance, individual coverage can cost $12,000 to $20,000 annually for families, substantially increasing the basic expense calculations. The practical approach for progressing toward this stage involves gradually building income-generating assets while maintaining realistic expectations about timelines and challenges. Setting intermediate goals like covering one monthly expense through passive income provides psychological reinforcement and practical experience with income-focused investing. However, pursuing this stage requires an honest assessment of your risk tolerance and backup plans. Market downturns can temporarily reduce income from investments, requiring either additional reserves or flexibility to adjust expenses during difficult periods. Most importantly, recognize that reaching this stage represents a significant achievement that requires substantial time, discipline, and often some favorable market conditions. While the benefits can be transformational, the path involves real sacrifices and risks that must be carefully considered. Stage 3, the leverage and scaling stage. The third stage of wealth building involves strategically using leverage to amplify results beyond what individual effort and capital alone can achieve. However, this stage requires substantial knowledge, experience, and capital from previous stages, and involves significant risks that can destroy wealth as easily as created. Understanding both the opportunities and dangers becomes crucial for anyone considering this advanced approach to wealth building. Leverage in wealth building takes several forms, each with distinct risk profiles and requirements. Financial leverage involves using borrowed money to control larger assets than your capital alone could purchase. Real estate represents the most common example where mortgage financing enables ownership of properties worth several times your down payment. If property values appreciate, your returns get amplified because gains apply to the full property value rather than just your initial investment. However, financial leverage amplifies losses just as dramatically as gains. A 20% decline in property values affects your entire investment, not just your down payment portion. If you purchased a $500,000 property with $100,000 down and it declines to $400,000, you've lost your entire initial investment despite the property retaining 80% of its value. This asymmetric risk makes leverage particularly dangerous for inexperienced investors or those without adequate reserves. Business leverage involves building systems, teams, and processes that generate income beyond your personal time investment. Successful businesses can create value that scales independently of the owner's direct involvement, enabling wealth growth that exceeds what employment or passive investing typically provides. However, business ownership involves operational risks, market competition, regulatory changes, and management challenges that require substantial expertise and ongoing attention. Network leverage represents perhaps the most subtle but powerful form of wealth acceleration. Access to exclusive investment opportunities, business partnerships, industry knowledge, or influential connections can provide advantages unavailable through public markets or individual effort. However, building valuable networks typically requires years of relationship development, professional achievement, and often substantial existing wealth that opens doors to exclusive opportunities. The mathematical appeal of leverage becomes obvious when successful strategies multiply returns dramatically. A real estate investor who purchases properties appreciating 5% annually while using 80% financing effectively earns 25% returns on invested capital, assuming positive cash flow covers carrying costs. Business owners whose companies grow 20% annually while requiring minimal additional capital investment can achieve wealth growth rates impossible through traditional employment or investing. However, these optimistic scenarios ignore the substantial risks and requirements that make leverage inappropriate for most people. Real estate markets can decline for extended periods, rental properties can experience vacancy or major repairs, and business ventures can fail despite careful planning. The complexity of managing leveraged investments often exceeds what busy professionals can handle effectively while maintaining their primary careers. Successful leverage requires extensive knowledge about specific markets, industries, or asset classes that most people lack. Real estate investing demands understanding of local markets, property evaluation, financing options, tax implications, and property management. Business ownership requires industry expertise, operational knowledge, marketing skills, and financial management capabilities that take years to develop. The capital requirements for this stage typically exceed what most Americans accumulate during their working careers. Effective real estate leverage often requires 20 to 25% down payments plus reserves for maintenance and vacancy, meaning substantial liquid capital beyond your primary residence and retirement accounts. Business, investment, or acquisition requires even larger capital commitments, plus the financial stability to weather potential losses without affecting your basic financial security. Timing considerations become crucial because leverage amplifies the impact of market cycles on your wealth. Entering leverage investments during market peaks can lead to devastating losses, while strategic timing during market downturns can accelerate wealth building dramatically. However, market timing requires expertise and luck that even professional investors struggle to achieve consistently. Professional guidance becomes essential during this stage because the complexity and risks exceed what most individuals can manage independently. Real estate attorneys, tax professionals, business advisors, and financial planners provide expertise that can prevent costly mistakes and optimize strategies for your specific circumstances. The psychological challenges of this stage often prove as difficult as the technical requirements. Leverage amplifies both gains and losses, creating emotional volatility that can lead to poor decision-making. The stress of managing borrowed money, business operations, or complex investments can affect family relationships and personal well-being in ways that pure financial calculations cannot capture. Risk management becomes paramount during this stage, because leverage can quickly destroy wealth accumulated over decades of disciplined saving and investing. Maintaining adequate insurance coverage, diversification across asset classes, and conservative assumptions about returns and risks help protect against catastrophic losses that could undermine your financial security. Most importantly, recognize that this stage is optional rather than necessary for financial success. Many people achieve substantial wealth and financial independence through the first two stages without ever using significant leverage. The complexity, risks, and knowledge requirements make leverage inappropriate for most investors, and the potential rewards don't justify the risk for people who lack extensive experience and substantial capital reserves. Conclusion: these three wealth building stages represent predictable patterns that many successful investors experience, but they require realistic expectations about timelines, risks, and individual circumstances. Most people need 10 to 30 years to progress through all stages, and many never reach the third stage due to its complexity and capital requirements. The first stage challenges your patience and discipline as compound returns feel meaningless on small amounts. The second stage requires substantial capital accumulation, often $500,000 to $1 million or more, depending on your expenses to generate sufficient passive income. The third stage involves leverage strategies that can accelerate wealth, but also create significant risks that can destroy decades of progress. Understanding these stages helps set appropriate expectations and strategies for your current situation. But success isn't guaranteed and depends heavily on market conditions, personal circumstances, and avoiding major financial mistakes. Many people build substantial wealth and achieve financial security without ever using significant leverage from the third stage. The key insights that separate successful wealth builders from everyone else: first, wealth building follows predictable stages that most people abandon too early. The compound interest threshold requires years of discipline before meaningful results appear, but this foundation enables exponential growth in later stages. Second, each stage requires different strategies and realistic timelines. Expecting immediate results from long-term strategies leads to frustration and repeated false starts that prevent progress through the stages. Third, persistence through stages matters more than investment skill or market timing. The people who build substantial wealth aren't necessarily smarter, they maintain discipline long enough for mathematics to work in their favor. Fourth, understanding your current stage transforms financial frustration into strategic progress. Knowing what to expect and when helps maintain motivation during the inevitable slow periods. Which stage are you currently working toward? Are you building your initial investment base through the compound interest threshold, working toward passive income that covers your basic expenses, or considering more advanced leverage strategies? Your biggest challenge in progressing to the next level likely involves either maintaining discipline during slow progress, building sufficient capital for meaningful income generation, or developing the expertise needed for advanced strategies. The path to substantial wealth isn't mysterious or dependent on secret strategies. It follows predictable mathematical patterns that reward patience, discipline, and realistic expectations about timelines. However, individual results vary significantly based on personal circumstances, market conditions, and implementation quality. This represents educational information about general wealth building patterns, not personalized financial advice. Remember that all investment strategies involve substantial risks, including potential loss of principal, and market timing cannot be predicted reliably. Leveraged investments can result in losses exceeding your initial investment. Always consult qualified financial professionals before making major investment or financial planning decisions. Your journey through these wealth building stages starts with understanding where you are now and maintaining the discipline to progress to the next level, regardless of how long it takes.